tie up with sort of thinking about the regulation of taboo words. And here I mean the formal regulation. So the regulation by government agencies, by film agencies, by television agencies, by streaming people, like sort of how is it that taboo words are actually being regulated, and also why they're being regulated. Okay, so to start, we'll go with what do we know about taboo words. So we know that the word taboo itself is a borrowing from Tongan, tapu, and in Tongan it means something forbidden, and it's usually attached to religious taboo or what's called sacrilege. What we also know is that the sources of taboo are super consistent. Now, they're not perfectly the same, but they're pretty consistent cross-culturally and cross-linguistically. They tend to be around religious topics, bodies and what bodies do, sex, some kinds of bodily outputs, and they also tend to include sets of terms that are used to describe people. And so that's a lot of what, when we think about what things going on campuses, that's a lot of the focus. I will say for this talk, I'm not actually addressing those types of taboo words. So you can think of this as sort of the classic taboo words, the actual sort of four-letter words. So, and the reason for that is theoretical and data-driven. And if you want to know why, I can tell you at the end. The other thing about them is they have degrees of offensiveness, and people have very consistent knowledge about that. So you can ask people, you know, which of these words is the most offensive, and they will be pretty consistent in what they say. In English, probably for at least the last 50 or 60 years, there's a set of somewhere between 7 and 10 words that very consistently show up as super tabooed. You're going to hear two of them a lot today, fuck and shit, and they show up as super tabooed. There's a word, and I'm actually not going to say it, but it starts with a C. That word is super tabooed and also rarely occurs. So there's some interesting differences in how offensiveness plays in to actual use. Things do change, but it's not as much as you might think. They don't change as quickly as other kinds of words. People have pretty consistent understandings or beliefs about which words you shouldn't say, and they're ranking relative to one another. And there's not a lot of research at all about taboo language, but there is some research about that particular fact. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, taboo words are just sort of paradoxical. And again, this is the kinds of words I'm talking about, the sort of classic taboos, are actually quite different in this regard than taboo words that are describing groups of people or individual people. Those tend to actually behave a little bit differently. Okay, so part of what we're going to go through now is just kind of why are these interesting and what ways are they interesting? So they're cognitively interesting. So they affect language production, they affect language processing, and they also are tied to language development or language acquisition. So uttering a taboo word actually reduces pain. So if you hit yourself in the head, or I think as Martin Hilbert was saying, if you kick someone in the shin, one response they can have is, oh shit, right? And that will can actually reduce the pain. I forgot to tell you one thing. That QR code, if you find it easier to have the slides to look at as I'm talking, you can get them from that QR code, and my contact information is there as well. So I'll leave you a second or two to get that. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting about, cognitively interesting, is these taboo words or their use tends to correlate with the big 5 personality characteristics that Martin Hilbert was also talking about. So if you're a person who is more open or more neurotic, these are the terms. I mean, neurotic doesn't mean exactly what we think it means colloquially. It's more about being sort of more anxious or more concerned about things. Those 2 personality traits tend to correlate with higher taboo use. Agreeableness and conscientiousness tend to correlate with lower taboo use. And if you know about the personality factors, that isn't a surprise, but it is pretty interesting from the perspective of language production and processing. The other thing that is very interesting, and particularly around the question of how we regulate taboo, is the question of children. So children tend to develop, and this is pretty consistent, an awareness of tabooness around the age of 6. So prior to that, they may use taboo words, but they won't really have they don't seem to really have a sense of the tabooness of the word. I mean, they know it gets a response and they know all of those kinds of things, but not the taboo. And it's about 6 when they start to recognize something about things being very tabooed. And when they first start, and if you have been around young children, you will know this, they rate the offensiveness of really mild taboos very high. So for a young child, calling someone a dork or a jerk or saying fart, all of those things, which are relatively mild taboos for older children and adults, are quite taboo for young children. And this is going to matter over time, because what I'm going to show you is that most of the regulation from the last, well, really since the mid-60s, has been focused on children from encountering taboo words. So it's actually different than the prohibition. So it's actually about children and kind of what children should or could be exposed to. The other thing to know about it is that taboo words, even if you are highly fluent in multiple languages, the language or languages you learned first as a young child, as a baby human, they're the ones that you will, in those languages, you'll process taboo words more effectively and more efficiently than in subsequent languages. So there is a sort of developmental component to that as well. And then finally, and this is also pretty interesting and will be interesting in terms of thinking cerebrally, taboo words, part of their meaning seems to be about emotion and affect. So a lot of the use of a taboo word, when you utter it or when you hear it, it engages the emotional aspects of our cognitive lives and also our cerebral lives. So one of the things that especially brain scientists have noticed for a long time is that people who have damage to certain parts of the brain, and particularly if the damage is such that it affects the ability of the person to productively and propositionally use language, it doesn't seem to inhibit taboo use. So people with aphasia often have perfectly robust ability to curse. Tourette's, which is another kind of neurodivergent condition, also has a version that includes kind of uninhibited use of often very highly offensive or highly tabooed words. The same is true with dementia and Alzheimer's. So the ability to use taboo words doesn't seem to be the same as the ability to use other kinds of language. And part of that is because it looks, and this is where the emotions will come back in, it seems the case, there's not a lot of study of this, but that the activation of taboo words, so if you hear a taboo word or you use a taboo word, it actually is more activated in the right hemisphere, so it's more lateralized to the right, whereas most language is lateralized on the left. Now, to actually inhibit a taboo word, you have to have both hemispheres engaged, because being able to inhibit it is tied to aspects of the prefrontal cortex, particularly the left side of it. Other things too that I'm not going to tell you about, mostly because I don't entirely understand the brain, but just you'll have to trust, take it on faith, that what we know is that both hemispheres need to be involved in order to inhibit using a taboo word. And the other thing that we know is that if there is some damage to the parts of the brain that are tied to executive function, will increase, and that's because the function of inhibition is compromised. If, however, the amygdala is damaged, you lower the rate of taboo use. And that's because the processing and production of emotions have been compromised. So if you remember, taboo words are tied to kind of emotive affect. kind of just generally emotion. So if you damage the part of the brain that is large, and I'm simplifying this fairly significantly, but if you damage that part of the brain that processes emotion, you also lower the likelihood that the person or you will use a taboo word. And then, like, I'm a linguist, so there's lots to say about why they're linguistically interesting. So just historically, one of the really kind of cool things is that words that essentially refer to the same object in the world, the Germanic ones tend to be the taboos, and the Latinate ones tend to be non-tabooed, and even often highly formal. Like you would use defecation in a formal context. And so there's this kind of, and that particular distinction holds in lots of realms, also in taboo. We see that they function, especially, and probably their most common function is as an intensifier. So they intensify the propositional content. So usually they are acting adverbally on an adjective, though not always then. They are interjections. And so one of the things that we know is that we use interjections when we are hurt. And as you saw a couple slides ago, we actually, by using interjections, particularly taboo words as interjections, we reduce our actual pain. And so it's not surprising that they can function and do function as interjections. A recent paper by Lev, Ari, and McKay, I think it's 2021, showed that cross-linguistically, there are some common sound patterns tied to taboo words. So for instance, taboo words, cross-linguistic, it's not a perfect match, so it doesn't hold for every single language, but for many, there's a strong tendency. The taboo words don't include sounds like L, R, W, or Y, but their euphemisms often do. So if you think about damn, when you euphemize that, one of them is darn. So the R, and that's a particular class of sounds. So there's something about the sound structure, it's hard to know exactly what, that is tied to taboo use. And then for English, and these are kind of trivial in some ways, but also interesting. Only taboo words can fit in certain structural positions. So if you think about suffixes and prefixes, so English uses those a lot, but English doesn't really use where you put something in the middle of a word, except for a taboo word. So you can say fan-fucking-tastic, but you can't say fan-very-tastic. So it's really only taboo words that fit in. And again, these are fairly rare, but nonetheless interesting because they capture something different about taboo words than other kinds of words. They are as frequent in corpora. So if you look at corpora of English speech, taboo words are about as frequent as first-person pronouns. So, which is, I mean, it's somewhere around, the pronouns are about 1%. So if you look in a corpus, you'll see about 1% of first person, both singular and plural pronouns, but all cases. And that's roughly similar for taboo words. There's some ways in which these counts might be not totally accurate, but they are fairly consistent in different corpora, including corpora of taboo language in the mass media. And then finally, they're part of what we might say the meaning of context. So we can talk about the use of taboo words. We have a good sense of, so pragmatics is about how we get meaning from the context we're in and the context in which language is being used. And so the pragmatics will tell you, for instance, whether you should be offended by me saying fuck or not. Right? And you're in a kind of funny position with that because the way I just used it is a little iffy. But you're probably going to give it to me because this is the context and this is the topic of the talk. And then we can also talk about that fact. So if you were to suddenly say, hey, you know what? You are really offending me. That's you accessing your knowledge about how context plays a role in the meaning of a particular interaction. So these are some of the linguistically interesting things. I'm going to show you now a clip. This is a pretty iconic clip. I'm only going to show you the first part of it from the television series, the HBO series, The Wire. And in this clip, you will see the unfolding of solving a murder where the only word used is fuck or one of its derivatives. So that was a good example of the interjection. My apologies that I didn't let you know beforehand that there would be some disturbing images, photographs in this clip. I don't think there are any more like that, but as I was watching, I was like, whoa, I should have let people know that that was going to be true. This clip goes on for about 5 minutes, and they never use any other word than fuck. So they fully solve. It's a fantastic scene. If you haven't seen it, Google it or ask ChatGPT to find it for you, because it's a phenomenal scene. And it really shows the multifunctionality of taboo words. Not a single one of those instances had anything to do with the sexual meaning of fuck, with its actual dictionary meaning. They were all doing something very different than that. Also, even in a sense, referencing something different than that. So that brings us to this issue that I was alluding to when I said we know something about the pragmatics. We are aware of how context influences what we actually can understand about language and how we understand it. So again, we have this paradox. They're tabooed, but they're used anyway. Our assessment of the context, and I'll talk in a couple minutes about what aspects of the context we pay particular attention to, but the context is directly relevant to the offensiveness that we experience as users. So not both as producers and also as receivers or processors. I'm using the term user rather than speaker and listener, just because there's lots of modalities for language, or at least a few, maybe not a lot. And so I'm trying not to be speech centric here. So the terminology might sound odd to you if you're not used to it, but in general, producers and receivers of the language use the context to assess whether or not a taboo word or what the taboo word's meaning actually is. And that's not just true for taboo words, it's true generally. Taboo words especially indicate high emotional states. So they occur especially when people, most frequently actually, when people are angry or frustrated, but they are also used when people are very surprised or very happy. And in fact, the last court case, Supreme Court case that was about taboo language was based on Bono getting a Lifetime Achievement Award, I think at the Grammys, and he said, "This is fucking brilliant." So that was about happiness, but it also excited the regulatory apparatus. They can also be used very much for social closeness. So if you think about yourselves as either children of someone or parents of someone, the point at which parents and children mutually use taboo language together is usually an indication of the parents' recognition of something like adulthood in their child. So these kinds, I mean, people vary, but somewhere in the teenage to early 20s is when people, again, depending on context, and certainly not everybody, but if you are in a dyad with parents and children, the point at which both are using taboo words together is usually marking a kind of new social relationship. And so the other thing about them that is important is that the prohibition of use is part of the meaning of a taboo word. And so the taboo itself is always in a kind of dialectic relationship between its use and its regulation or a response to it. And that's where the kind of contextual meaning plays itself out. So not in the dictionary meaning of the term or even necessarily in any of the relevant functions it can perform, but in its actual utterance. And once it's uttered, there is a response of some kind. So that's where the sort of aspects of social cognition and aspects of our ability to assess something about the social world comes into play in that dialectic between use and response or use and regulation. It's special for taboo words because they are at least nominally prohibited. So that relationship exists for any kind of meaning in language, but it has a different kind of meaning with taboo words. And then, as I mentioned before, we have the metapragmatics. And the metapragmatics, I mean, is really where you can start to see what kind of social knowledge we have by how we talk about it. And this is social knowledge about language use in particular. So how is it that we are able to say something like, don't say that, or you have really just offended me, or I don't like that kind of language? Those are all comments where you're using language to talk about language. So the metapragmatics can give us insight into the relationship between our own beliefs and thoughts about how language works, what language is, what its structure's like, how we use it, and the micro interactional components of interacting with one another regularly. So here's an example of the metapragmatics at work. This is from the Apple TV series Shrinking. So there you see the character not in the hot tub talking about how it is that he is assuming or assessing or interpreting the character in the hot tub as not being happy. And here the fucking there is not, it's sort of like intensification, but it's really a sort of sarcasm, right? So it's highlighting, in fact, that the character in the hot tub is not happy. And the character out of the hot tub, and I'm using those terms because I don't remember the characters' names, is commenting on that, on how you can know that that utterance meant that character is not happy. And it hinged on the taboo word there. I mean, not only that, there's some other semiotics going on, what the guy looks like, his kind of long expression, but it's that term that kind of highlights or concentrates the semiotic power of the taboo word. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about, like I said, about how it is that we use our social knowledge, and here I mean like our kind of knowledge as a cognitive sense with our encounters with taboo words. So one of the things that we know, and we've known this for a good long time, is this comes, if you're familiar with speech act theory, this comes from J.L. Austin, John Searle, Judith Butler has often also talked about this, and that is that we don't just use language to refer to things. We don't just use language to share our thoughts with others. Like in a sense, language is the conduit we have to read each other's minds, right? We do that through language, but we don't only do that. We also actually do actions. We use language to change things about what's going on. And when we talk about it that way, and especially in the situation of sociolinguistic variation, we're talking about language as a form of social action. So just to give you an example, you may or may not be able to tell that I grew up in the South. But if I said something like, hey, it's great to see y'all today. The y'all, and it's heard laughs, immediately will catch your attention, because it's incongruous with this context. And so you're going to start thinking like, wait a minute, doesn't y'all mean Southern? Okay, she said she was Southern. Doesn't it also mean uneducated? Wait a minute, she's someone as a professor somewhere. Doesn't it also mean like informal? So there's an incongruence there. And by using y'all, even though I was really just mentioning it, I wasn't really using it, although I am happy that you're here. I changed something. You now have a different understanding of me. Even if I hadn't said, you may or may not know I'm Southern. As soon as I say y'all, all of that's going to come forward. And I have done that. I know that's going to happen. And I did it by saying y'all. So that is the idea of doing things with language. And here's an example from the audiovisual media where the actual meaning of a word is doing the thing. So this is an ancient film from 1968, so the first version of Planet of the Apes. Okay, so what's going on there? He is actually uttering a curse. He's in a context where that works. He is saying, kind of basically humans from the past, he's damning them. And not only is he damning them, but he's evoking God damning them. He's not saying God damn. He's saying God damn you. So that kind of use of that kind of verb is what's called a performative verb. So that's a kind of verb that names its own action. So if I say, I promise I'll buy you all ice cream after this talk. By saying promise, I've done it. I have made the promise. However, there's a problem. And that is, these only work if the conditions are right. So the way that Searle and Austin talked about the necessary conditions, they use the term felicity. Judith Butler has used the term citationality. What I'm showing you here is sort of an amalgam of those two. So felicity are the conditions that have to be true in order for the performative verb to also be true. So when you're saying it, you have to have the authority to say it. I can't actually make a promise to buy you all ice cream. I don't have the authority to do it. Also not the right context. And you don't recognize that as other examples of promises that did work. Largely because it's the wrong context. I'm not someone who can do that. And that piece of it, what Butler calls the citationality, you have to recognize this action as a sort of similar to other actions that you have recognized in the past. And this is where you really see the dynamic aspects of our pragmatics and our sense of using context to make meaning. Is because the context, although the meaning of the verb damn is curse, you can only do it if you happen to be in a situation where you can curse someone, right? And they have to recognize that as well. So it's not just your own intentions, but also how others interpret you. That makes the performative power work. Now, interestingly, within the audiovisual media, felicity works in two different channels. It works internal to the narrative. So people have to, inside the narrative, the characters have to recognize, and we sort of saw that in the shrinking clip, right? Where the one character is saying overtly what he knows about the taboo word and what it's doing. But it also has to be felicitous outside the narrative. It has to be felicitous for a mass audience that you may be able to guess as a producer of audiovisual content, but you have no way of knowing. It has to be felicitous for them too. And felicitous isn't just like, it's a good thing. You can also have, cursing is not good, particularly. So the valence of positive or negative isn't tied to the success. The success is actually tied to the person recognizing it for what it is. Now, one of the things that Judith Butler really pointed out, so here I've just been giving you examples of performative verbs, verbs whose meaning is the thing they name. But it turns out that all of language can do that. And a performative utterance is an utterance that enacts generally or produces what it names within a felicitous context. So the classic example from Judith Butler is a baby is born, you pick it up and you say, it's a girl. And that by saying that, you have performed, you have constituted this new being as a girl. Whether that's true to what this child may grow up to be or what their body says or anything else. That's the performative effect of a whole utterance. Whole languages can work that way. So if I suddenly shifted into Spanish, that would be some strange action. Even stranger, many of you could understand me if I switched to Turkish. You might not even know what language I'm using. That's an action. That's doing something. When we think about the audiovisual media, and I love this picture because it has that sort of Simpsons context, you have to think in sort of three layers to think about the felicitousness of things going on in the media. So one is you have the performative. And in some sense, that idea, you know sort of what it means. It is also interactive once it's uttered. And then you have the actual performing of the performative. So in the context of the audiovisual media, you can think about these are the script writers and the producers and the actors as they practice and all of that kind of thing. That's the performing. And then you have the actual performance where it is done. And once you have the performance, again, this isn't just for the audiovisual media, but because the audiovisual media have such a concentrated semiotic value, they have to use language and other semiotic tools, other visual or other kinds of actions to convey information very quickly. And that's why a number of linguistic anthropologists, Richard Bauman, Joel Scherzer, sociolinguists, not only me, but also John Rickford, have talked about how the media give us insight into what we believe and think about language and how